The chill of late autumn clung to the stone corridors of Ashworth Hall, seeping through the ancient walls and settling into the marrow of those who dwelled within. Lady Eleanor Whitfield pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, the thin fabric offering little defense against the pervasive cold that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the great house. She had been a guest for 3 weeks, yet the grandeur of the place still felt alien, a world of gilded portraits and whispered expectations that bore no resemblance to the modest parsonage of her youth. Her presence here was a matter of quiet charity, a fact she was never permitted to forget. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth, a woman carved from equal parts ice and aristocratic duty, had extended the invitation to Eleanor's ailing mother, a distant cousin. When her mother's health proved too fragile for travel, Eleanor had been dispatched in her stead, a suitable companion for the Dowager's quieter hours. She was, in every sense, a placeholder. Eleanor moved through the gallery, her fingers trailing lightly over the polished surface of a mahogany side table. The house was still, the servants having retreated to their below-stairs domain, the family occupied with their own pursuits. She had learned the rhythms of Ashworth Hall, the ebb and flow of its daily life, and she navigated it with the cautious grace of a mouse in a cat's domain. She was not unwelcome, precisely, but she was not of this world, and the distinction hung in the air with every glance from the Duchess's sharp eyes. Her heart was a quiet storm of anxieties as she approached the Duchess's private sitting room. She carried a small silver tray bearing a pot of tea, a delicate china cup, and a plate of dry biscuits, a ritual the Dowager required each afternoon at precisely 4 o'clock. The heavy oak door was ajar, a sliver of warm light spilling into the dim hallway. Eleanor paused, adjusting her grip on the tray, when a voice, deep and resonant, cut through the stillness. "She's just a placeholder, Mother." The word struck her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She knew that voice. It belonged to Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, a man whose presence commanded every room he entered. She had seen him only at dinner, a distant, imposing figure at the head of the long table, his attention always directed toward more important matters. He had never spoken more than a few formal words to her, his gaze passing over her as though she were part of the furniture. Eleanor's feet rooted to the spot. She should have retreated, should have made some sound to announce her presence, but her body refused to obey. She stood frozen, the silver tray trembling slightly in her hands, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "You speak of Miss Whitfield," the Dowager's voice replied, laced with a cool amusement. "That is rather uncharitable, Alexander. The girl is a useful companion, and she plays the pianoforte passably." "It matters little what she plays," the Duke said, his tone flat, dismissive. "She is a temporary fixture, a shadow to keep you company until a more suitable arrangement can be made. My attentions are required elsewhere." Eleanor's face flushed crimson, the heat a stark contrast to the icy dread spreading through her limbs. A placeholder, a shadow. The words echoed in her mind, stripping away the thin veneer of belonging she had painstakingly constructed. She had known her position was precarious, but to hear it stated so bluntly, with such cold finality, was a humiliation beyond anything she had imagined. Her mother had sent her here to secure connections, to perhaps find a suitable match, but she was not even considered a real person by the master of the house. She was merely occupying a space until someone better came along. A hot wave of shame washed over her, followed by a surge of bitter anger. She was not a fool. She knew the Duke was under pressure to marry, that his name was linked to the elegant and wealthy Lady Genevieve Ashford. Eleanor had seen them together at a recent dinner, the Duke's rare smiles directed at the beautiful heiress. She was not naive enough to dream of a future here, but to be dismissed as nothing, a mere interruption in his grand design, was a wound that cut to the bone. The clatter of a log shifting in the fireplace within the room startled her. The tray tipped. A single spoon slid from its place and clattered against the silver pot with a sharp, ringing sound that seemed to echo through the silent hallway like a gunshot. The conversation inside ceased abruptly. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. For a heartbeat, there was only the frantic thumping of her own heart. Then the heavy oak door was pulled open wide, and she found herself staring directly into the grim, questioning face of the Duke of Ashworth. His dark eyes narrowed, sweeping over her flushed cheeks and the tray in her trembling hands. His expression shifted from inquiry to a dawning, terrible comprehension. He knew. He knew she had heard every word. "Miss Whitfield," he said, her name sounding like a formal accusation. Eleanor lifted her chin, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Your Grace," she said, her tone brittle. "I was bringing the Duchess her tea." She stepped forward, placing the tray on a small table just inside the door, her movements precise and controlled, a stark contrast to the chaos within her. She refused to look at him, refused to let him see the tears that stung her eyes. But as she turned to leave, her gaze met his for a fleeting moment, and she saw something flicker there. Not remorse, but something closer to irritation, as though she had inconvenienced him by overhearing his private thoughts. The Dowager watched from her chair, her expression unreadable, a faint, knowing smile curving her thin lips. Eleanor curtsied, the movement stiff. "If you will excuse me." She did not wait for a dismissal. She turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured, the sound of her soft shoes on the stone floor the only noise in the suffocating silence. She would not run, she would not give him the satisfaction. But the word echoed with every step she took, a cruel whisper in the depths of her soul. Placeholder, shadow, unwanted. She had come to Ashworth Hall seeking a future, but she had just learned she had no place in its present. And the man who had unwittingly delivered that crushing truth would never know how deeply his careless words had cut. Eleanor did not flee to her room. That would have been surrender, and the small spark of pride that had carried her from the sitting room refused to be extinguished so easily. Instead, she slipped through a side door and into the biting chill of the formal gardens. The air was sharp, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves, and it cleared the fog of humiliation from her mind. She walked the gravel paths, her hands clenched at her sides, the cold seeping through her thin slippers. The Duke's words replayed in her mind, each repetition hunting the edge of her anger. A shadow, a temporary fixture. She had spent her life being overlooked, the quiet daughter of a humble clergyman, always in the background while others shone. She had come to Ashworth Hall hoping, perhaps foolishly, that this place might be different, that she might be seen for who she was, not merely what she lacked. She stopped before a stone bench overlooking a dormant rose garden, the skeletal branches reaching toward the gray sky like supplicant hands. She did not sit. She could not be still. "Miss Whitfield." The voice came from behind her, and she whirled, her heart leaping into her throat. The Duke stood at the edge of the path, his greatcoat swirling about his boots, his breath misting in the cold air. He looked out of place among the decaying foliage, a figure of controlled power silhouetted against the pale stone of the house. "Your Grace," she said, her voice colder than the air, "I was not aware you enjoyed gardens in autumn." He took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "I do not. I followed you." The confession startled her. She held her ground, lifting her chin. "I cannot imagine why. I am, after all, merely a placeholder, hardly worth the pursuit." A muscle in his jaw tightened. "You overheard a private conversation." "I overheard the truth," she corrected, her voice gaining strength. "There is no need to explain, Your Grace. Your words were exceptionally clear. I understand my position here with absolute clarity." He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "It was not my intention to cause you distress." "No," she agreed, a bitter smile touching her lips. "I am sure you intended no cruelty. You simply stated a fact. I am a convenience, nothing more. I have been a guest in your home for 3 weeks. And you have never once looked at me. Why would you? I am not Lady Genevieve Ashford with her fortune and her connections. I am not a suitable match for a duke." She had not meant to be so blunt, but the words tumbled out, fueled by weeks of quiet observation and the raw sting of his dismissal. He flinched, a barely perceptible shift in his expression, but enough to tell her she had struck a nerve. "You speak of things you do not understand," he said, his voice low. "I understand more than you think," Eleanor replied, her gaze unwavering. "I understand that you are under pressure to marry well, to secure the estate, to continue the noble Blackwood line. I understand that a woman like me, with no title and no fortune, is invisible in such considerations. But understanding does not make the words any less wounding, Your Grace." For a long, breathless moment, they stood facing each other, the only sounds the rustle of dead leaves and the distant call of a crow. The air between them crackled with an unexpected tension, a raw honesty that neither had anticipated. Then the Duke did something utterly unexpected. He lowered his head, a slow, deliberate movement that was almost a bow. "You are right," he said, his voice rougher now. "My words were careless and unkind. You did not deserve them. I apologize." Eleanor stared at him, her carefully constructed anger crumbling in the face of his unexpected humility. She had expected defensiveness, not contrition. The Duke of Ashworth, known for his pride and his sharp tongue, was apologizing to her. "It is forgotten," she said, though the words still echoed in her heart. "I do not believe it is," he said, meeting her eyes again. "And I do not wish it to be. You have shown me a truth I have been too willing to ignore. I have been so consumed by duty that I have ceased to see the people around me. You are not a shadow, Miss Whitfield. That much is already clear." Eleanor's breath caught. The intensity of his gaze sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. In that moment, the Duke was not the distant figure at the head of the table. He was a man, complex and conflicted, and the flicker of something in his eyes, regret perhaps or a dawning curiosity, made her pulse quicken. "Your Grace," she began, unsure of what to say. "Alexander," he corrected softly. "In private, I would have you call me Alexander." The request was improper, a breach of every rule of etiquette that governed their world. And yet, she felt the weight of it, the offering of a name as a bridge across the chasm between them. "Alexander," she repeated, the sound foreign and intimate on her tongue. He smiled then, a true smile that transformed his stern features, softening the hard lines of his face. The sight of it stole the breath from her lungs. It was the first time he had looked at her, truly looked at her, not through her but into her. "I am glad you did not run," he said quietly. "I have a feeling, Miss Whitfield, that you are far more formidable than anyone in that house gives you credit for." He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Eleanor standing in the cold autumn garden, her heart racing, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. The man who had dismissed her as nothing had just apologized, had offered her his Christian name, had looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. And in the space of a single afternoon, everything she thought she understood about her place at Ashworth Hall had been turned on its head. But the bitter word still lingered, a shadow of doubt in the back of her mind. Placeholder. Could a man who had spoken so carelessly ever truly see her as more? And what did it mean that the spark of hope he had just ignited felt far more dangerous than the cold indifference she had known before? The days following the garden confrontation passed in a strange, suspended tension. Eleanor went about her duties with the Dowager, reading aloud from tedious political tracts, accompanying her on short, stately walks through the still beautiful conservatory. But the air had shifted. The Duchess watched her with a more penetrating gaze, her thin smile suggesting a private amusement Eleanor could not decipher. And the Duke, Alexander, was present more often. He appeared at breakfast, a meal he had previously skipped, his dark eyes finding hers across the table. He lingered in the library when she went to select a novel, his tall frame blocking the doorway as he offered a quiet comment on the weather. He was not overt, not improper, but his presence became a constant, a magnetic pull she felt in every corner of the great house. And then the letter arrived. It was delivered by a liveried footman to Eleanor's private sitting room, a small north-facing chamber attached to her bedchamber. The paper was thick, the seal a crest she did not recognize. Her name was written in a firm, masculine hand. Miss Whitfield, I trust you will forgive the informality of this note. I wish to speak with you privately. There is a matter of some importance I would discuss. Meet me in the East Library at 11 o'clock this evening. I assure you it concerns your future here. A.B. Eleanor read the note 3 times, her heart pounding. A private meeting at night with a duke. It was the stuff of scandal. If they were discovered, her reputation, the only currency she truly possessed, would be shattered. And yet the word future drew her, a promise wrapped in danger. What could he possibly have to say? She spent the evening in a state of restless anxiety, moving through dinner like a ghost, her appetite vanished. The Duke was absent, which only deepened her unease. The Dowager made no comment, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. At 11:15, Eleanor slipped from her room, wrapped in a dark cloak. The corridors were silent, the candles guttering low in their sconces, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She moved quickly, her soft slippers making no sound on the thick carpets. The East Library was in a forgotten wing of the house, seldom used, its shelves filled with ancient leather-bound volumes that smelled of dust and time. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. A single candelabra burned on a large oak desk, its flame illuminating the figure of Alexander Blackwood, standing before the tall windows, his back to her. He turned as she entered, and the candlelight caught the hard lines of his face, the shadow of stubble on his jaw. "You came," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You did not leave me much choice," Eleanor replied, pulling the door closed behind her. "Your note was rather cryptic. And yet here you are." He gestured to a chair near the desk. "Please sit." She remained standing, her hands clasped before her. "I will stand. I find it easier to run if the need arises." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "A wise precaution, but I hope you will not find it necessary." He moved closer, the space between them shrinking with each step. "I owe you an explanation, Miss Whitfield, about the other afternoon, about my mother's plans and about Lady Genevieve." Eleanor's heart skipped. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. I am merely a guest in this house." "You are more than that," he said, his voice firm. "Or you could be. That is what I wish to discuss." He paused, raking a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of uncharacteristic frustration. "My mother has arranged a match between Lady Genevieve and myself. The contracts are being drawn. She is wealthy, well-connected, and will bring considerable advantage to the estate. It is a practical alliance, nothing more." Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "I see," she said quietly. "I fail to see how this concerns me." "It concerns you because I do not wish to marry her," Alexander said, the words sharp and sudden. "I have no feeling for her and she has none for me, but my mother is insistent. She sees the match as the only way to secure the Blackwood legacy." He stepped closer still until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "You, Miss Whitfield, are the only person in this house who has ever dared to speak the truth to me. You looked at me as a man, not a title. That is a rare and valuable thing." Eleanor's breath hitched. "I do not understand what you are asking." He held her gaze, his dark eyes intense. "I am asking you to help me, to stand with me, to be the reason I can refuse." The room seemed to tilt, the candlelight swimming before her eyes. The audacity of it, the sheer, breathtaking arrogance. He wanted her to be his shield, his excuse, his placeholder against the forced engagement. The word from that afternoon echoed in her mind with fresh cruelty. He did not see her as a woman to be loved. He saw her as a tool, a convenient interruption to his grand design. "You want me to be your decoy," she whispered, the realization dawning with bitter clarity. "A false attachment to drive away Lady Genevieve, a scandal to make an alliance with her impossible." His expression flickered, a shadow of guilt passing across his features. "It would not be false, not entirely. I find myself drawn to you, Eleanor, your honesty, your spirit. It is a dangerous attraction, but it is real. Attraction is not love, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and despair. And it is not a foundation for scandal. You would ruin me, your grace, to save yourself. Do not pretend this is anything more than it is. She saw the truth of it in his eyes, the flicker of shame that confirmed her words. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, and he would use any means necessary, even her. I would not ruin you, he said, but the protest sounded weak. Your very proposal is ruin, Eleanor whispered, her heart breaking. You offer me nothing but the chance to be your shield, your convenient distraction. I have been a placeholder my entire life, Alexander. I will not be one in your life as well. She turned and fled, the tears she had held at bay finally spilling down her cheeks. The door slammed shut behind her, and she ran through the dark corridors, the sound of her own ragged breathing filling her ears. He had called her here to use her, to make her a part of his scheme. The brief, fragile hope she had nurtured in the garden shattered into 1,000 pieces. She was not a woman to him. She was a means to an end. And the bitterest part was that, for a single, foolish moment, she had believed he might feel something real. Eleanor did not sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the canopy above, the silk fabric a dark blur through her tears. The hours passed in a torment of sleeplessness, her mind replaying the scene in the library, the cold calculation behind his passionate words. He had called it an attraction, but she knew the truth. It was desperation, the thrashing of a man caught in a trap, and she was simply the nearest object he could grasp. By dawn, she had made a decision. She would leave Ashworth Hall. She would return to her mother's parsonage, and whatever quiet, unremarkable future awaited her there. It was better to be insignificant in her own home than to be a pawn in the games of the aristocracy. She rose, her movements stiff and mechanical, and began to pack her meager belongings. Her few dresses were folded into a worn leather trunk, her few books and personal trinkets wrapped in paper. The act of packing was a balm, a reclaiming of her own will. She would not be a victim of their schemes. She would not be a placeholder. As she closed the trunk, a soft knock sounded at her door. Her heart lurched. She knew who it would be. Miss Whitfield. It was not the Duke's voice. It was the soft, aged tone of Barker, the head footman, a man who had shown her quiet kindness during her stay. Enter, she called, her voice rough from tears. Barker opened the door and stepped inside, his face creased with concern. He carried a small silver tray bearing a cup of tea and a folded piece of paper. Her Grace the Dowager requests your presence in the East drawing room at your earliest convenience, miss, and a note arrived for you earlier. Eleanor took the note, her fingers trembling. The seal was the same as the one from the night before. She broke it open. Eleanor, what I said was wrong. Please do not leave. Give me a chance to explain. There is more I have not told you, things that change everything. Alexander. She crumpled the paper in her hand, a fresh wave of anger washing over her. More he had not told her, more manipulations, more schemes. He had sensed her resolve to leave and was now scrambling to keep her here. She would not be swayed. Tell her Grace I will attend her directly, Eleanor said, her voice steady. Barker bowed and retreated. Eleanor smoothed her hair, pinched her cheeks to restore some color, and made her way to the East drawing room. The Dowager was seated by the fire, a vision of cool elegance in her black silk morning dress, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. She did not rise as Eleanor entered. Miss Whitfield, she said, her voice as smooth as polished ice, I trust you are well this morning. I am as well as can be expected, your Grace, Eleanor replied, curtsying. The Dowager's gaze swept over her, assessing. I understand there was some disturbance last night, a midnight meeting in the East Library. Servants talk, you know, they always do. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The meeting had been observed. The servants knew. If word spread, her reputation was already compromised. There was no impropriety, your Grace, Eleanor said, forcing her voice to remain calm. The Duke wished to discuss a matter of household business. It was brief. The Dowager's lips curved into a thin, knowing smile. "Do not insult my intelligence, child. I know my son. I know the look in his eyes when he speaks of you, and I know the desperation that drove him to such foolishness." She leaned forward, her eyes glittering. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Whitfield, one that will benefit us both." Eleanor's heart began to pound. Another proposition. Another scheme. She felt as though she were caught in a web woven by the Blackwood family, each thread tightening around her throat. "I am listening," Eleanor said cautiously. The Dowager settled back in her chair. "My son is a proud man. He chafes against the match I have arranged for him. He resents being managed. He seeks a rebellion, and he has chosen you as his instrument." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I am prepared to offer you a considerable sum, enough to provide for your mother and secure your own future. In return, you will disappear. You will leave Ashworth Hall and never contact my son again." The shock of it was a physical blow. Eleanor stared at the woman, her face a mask of cold civility, and saw the true depths of the Blackwood family's ruthless calculation. The Duke wanted to use her to escape his engagement. The Dowager wanted to use her to enforce it. She was nothing to either of them but a commodity, a problem to be solved with money or manipulation. "You would pay me to leave," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. The words tasted like ash. "I would," the Dowager said coolly. "Think of it as a kindness. You are not suited to this world, Miss Whitfield. You are a decent, honest girl. The Blackwood family is not decent, and it is certainly not honest. You would be devoured." Eleanor felt a strange, hollow calm settle over her. She had come here hopping for a new beginning, and she had found only a den of predators. The Duke, with his desperate charm. The Dowager, with her cold bribery. They were all the same. They saw her as a means to an end. She raised her chin, meeting the Dowager's gaze with a strength she did not know she possessed. "I will not be bought, Your Grace," she said, her voice ringing clear in the silent room. "And I will not be used, not by your son and not by you." The Dowager's expression flickered, a crack in her icy facade. "You are making a mistake." "The only mistake I made was coming here," Eleanor replied. "I am leaving Ashworth Hall this afternoon. I want nothing more from your family, and I will certainly take nothing from your hands." She turned and walked toward the door, her legs trembling but her spirit aflame. She had finally found her voice, and it was a weapon the Blackwood family had not expected. She would not be a shadow. She would not be a placeholder. She would walk away from this gilded cage with her pride intact, even if it broke her heart to do so. But as she reached for the door handle, the door swung open, and Alexander Blackwood stood in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. He had heard everything, and in his eyes she saw a depth of emotion she had not anticipated. Not guilt, not shame, but something that looked terrifyingly like grief. "Eleanor," he said, her name a broken whisper, "please, there is something you must know about your mother, about why she sent you here. It was not chance, it was a message." Eleanor froze, her hand still on the door handle, her heart lurching into her throat. Her mother. A message. The world tilted on its axis, and suddenly every assumption she had made crumbled into dust. What had he discovered? And why did his face look as though he had just seen a ghost? Alexander stepped into the room, his gaze never leaving Eleanor's face. He seemed older somehow, the weight of some new burden pressing down on his broad shoulders. He did not look at his mother, who had risen from her chair, her expression sharp with alarm. "Alexander," the Dowager said, her voice sharp, "this is not the time. Miss Whitfield has announced her intention to leave. Let her go." "You will be silent," Alexander said, his voice a low command that brooked no argument. The Dowager's mouth snapped shut, a flush of anger rising to her cheeks. He turned back to Eleanor, his eyes softening with a grief so profound it made her chest ache. "Eleanor, please, sit down. What I have to tell you is not meant for standing in a doorway." Eleanor's hand slid from the handle. She did not sit, but she did not leave. "Tell me," she whispered, "tell me what you have discovered." Alexander took a deep breath as though bracing himself. After our conversation in the library, I was troubled. Your reaction. It forced me to look at things I had been ignoring. I began to question why my mother had invited your mother, a distant cousin she had not corresponded with in years, to visit now, of all times. He turned to the Dowager, his gaze icy. And why she was so insistent on the match with Lady Genevieve. The Dowager's face tightened, but she said nothing. I went through the family ledgers, Alexander continued, his voice heavy. The Blackwood Trust. There are documents that were altered, entries that were hidden. I found a codicil to my father's will, one that my mother has kept concealed for over 20 years. He pulled a folded paper from his inside pocket, its edges yellowed with age. It changes everything. Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. What does it say? Alexander unfolded the paper, his hands not quite steady. My father had a sister. She was disowned when she married a clergyman against the family's wishes. Her name was Margaret Whitfield. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. Your mother, Eleanor. Your mother is Margaret Whitfield. She is the true heir to a substantial portion of the Blackwood estate. The room seemed to spin. Eleanor grasped the back of a chair to steady herself. Her mother, a Blackwood. The family she had always believed was impoverished gentry living on the charity of distant relatives. It was impossible, and yet the look on Alexander's face told her it was the truth. The codicil states that upon the death of my father the estate was to be divided, Alexander said, his voice rough. The title and the main seat to me, but a significant fortune, including the lands in the north and the London house, to my Aunt Margaret and her heirs. My mother, he glanced at the Dowager, his expression hardening, has hidden this document for decades. She has been quietly paying your mother a small allowance to keep her silent, while keeping the bulk of the inheritance for the estate. Eleanor stared at the Dowager, who had gone pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. The elegant, cold woman who had offered her money to disappear was not protecting her son. She was protecting a lie. She was protecting a stolen inheritance. My mother knew, Eleanor whispered, the realization dawning with sickening clarity. She sent me here to see the house, to understand what was kept from her. She told me to trust no one. I thought she was simply being cautious. Tears welled in her eyes, a mix of fury and betrayal. She has been living in poverty while you— She turned to the Dowager, her voice rising. While you sat in this grand house, passing judgment on me, offering me coins to run away like a common nuisance. You are a thief. The Dowager's composure shattered. I did it for the estate, she cried, her voice shrill. The Blackwood name, the legacy, it would have been divided, diminished. Your mother was a foolish girl who chose love over family. She did not deserve the fortune. That was not your choice to make, Alexander said, his voice cold and hard. You defrauded my aunt. You defrauded Eleanor. You have lied to me every day of my life. He looked at the document in his hand, his jaw tight. And you have tied my hands with this engagement to Lady Genevieve, a match designed to bring in money to cover the very debts you created by hoarding what was not yours. The pieces fell into place with a sickening click. Eleanor understood now. The Duke's desperation, the forced engagement, his mother's ruthless manipulation. It was all built on a foundation of lies, with her own family as the victim. I am so sorry, Eleanor, Alexander said, his voice barely a whisper. I did not know. I should have looked sooner. I should have questioned. Eleanor shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. My entire life, she said, her voice breaking. My mother's quiet pride, her insistence that I behave with grace because our name meant something, even without fortune. She was protecting me from the truth, that we were robbed by the very family she had been taught to love. She looked at Alexander, and in her eyes was a storm of emotion, anger, grief, and a terrible, aching confusion. He was not her enemy. He had been as deceived as she. But he was still the Duke of Ashworth, the heir to the legacy that had been built on her mother's stolen birthright. I need to see her, Eleanor said, her voice hardening. I need to tell her what you have found, but I need to know, Alexander, what do you intend to do? He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw a resolve that matched her own. I intend to make this right. The inheritance will be restored to your family. The engagement to Lady Genevieve will be broken. My mother will answer for what she has done." He paused, his voice dropping. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are not, and never were, a placeholder. You are the woman who has shown me the truth, and I will not let you walk away without knowing what that means to me." Eleanor's breath caught. The world had shifted beneath her feet, the ground of her identity cracking open to reveal a chasm of secrets and betrayals. But in the middle of the ruins, Alexander Blackwood was standing there, offering not just an apology but a promise. And despite everything, a small, fragile ember of hope flickered to life in her heart. But the Dowager was not finished. She rose from her chair, her face twisted with fury. "You will ruin us all," she hissed. "Lady Genevieve's father has already signed the preliminary contracts. If you break this engagement, the scandal will destroy us. And as for that inheritance," she glared at Eleanor, "I will fight it in every court in the land. You will not see a penny." The threat hung in the air, a final, bitter challenge. Eleanor looked from the Dowager's enraged face to Alexander's determined one, and she knew the battle was far from over. The truth had set her free, but it had also declared war. And she was standing on the front lines. The morning that followed was one of upheaval. The servants, sensing the seismic shift in the house, moved with hushed steps and averted eyes. Eleanor, having spent the remainder of the night in a state of fevered wakefulness, now stood in her room, dressed in a simple traveling gown, her packed trunk at her feet. She had not changed her intention to leave. The truth of her mother's inheritance had not altered the fact that she needed to see her, to speak with her, to understand the life that had been stolen from them. Alexander had offered to accompany her. He had stood at her door at dawn, his face pale, his voice urgent. "Let me take you," he had said. "You should not travel alone, and there are things I must say to your mother myself, things that are long overdue." She had refused, her heart a maelstrom of conflicting loyalties. She did not know who to trust. Alexander had been deceived, yes, but he was still a Blackwood. The name itself now felt like a brand, a symbol of the aristocratic greed that had reduced her mother to a quiet, dignified poverty. But when she descended the grand staircase, she found a carriage waiting, not the modest hired hack she had requested, but the Duke's own black-lacquered coach, the Ashworth crest emblazoned on the door. Alexander stood beside it, his greatcoat buttoned against the morning chill, his expression one of quiet, unyielding determination. "I am not asking your permission," he said, his voice low. "I am telling you, I will not let you face this alone." Eleanor looked into his eyes, and for a long moment she said nothing. The anger she had felt the night before had not faded, but it was now tempered by a weariness that made her yearn for an ally, even a flawed one. "Very well," she said, her voice tight. "But you will not speak to my mother unless she gives her consent. She has been used by your family enough. I will not allow her to be ambushed." Alexander nodded, his jaw tight. "You have my word." The journey to the Whitfield parsonage took the better part of a day. The landscape rolled past the carriage windows, the bare winter trees like black veins against a leaden sky. They spoke little, the silence between them heavy with unspoken questions. Eleanor watched the fields, the small villages, the lives of ordinary people passing by, and she felt the chasm between her world and the Duke's widening with every mile. And yet, when the carriage lurched over a rough patch of road and his hand reached out to steady her, she did not pull away. At dusk, the carriage turned down a narrow lane and drew up before a modest stone house, its windows glowing with warm, welcoming light. Eleanor's heart clenched at the sight. Home. It was smaller than she remembered, humbler, but it was hers, and the sight of it brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. The door opened before they could knock. Margaret Whitfield stood in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her thin shoulders, her face pale with surprise. She was a small woman, but her bearing was upright, her gray eyes sharp and intelligent. Those eyes widened as she saw the carriage, the crest, and the tall, dark-haired man standing behind her daughter. "Eleanor," she whispered, What has happened? Why is he here? Mother, Eleanor said, stepping forward to embrace her. We need to talk. There is much you have not told me. Inside, the parsonage was small and neat, the furnishings simple but well kept. A fire burned in the grate, casting long shadows on the walls. Margaret led them into the sitting room, her movements stiff, her gaze wary. She did not invite Alexander to sit. Explain yourself, she said, her voice cold as she addressed the Duke. Why have you brought my daughter home in such a state? What has happened at that house? Eleanor took her mother's hands, urging her to sit. Mother, please listen. It was not what we thought. The Duke discovered something about your father's will, about the inheritance that was kept from you. Margaret's face went deathly pale. What are you talking about? Alexander stepped forward, his voice low and respectful. Mrs. Whitfield, my father's will contained a codicil hidden by my mother. It states that you were to receive a substantial portion of the Blackwood estate upon his death. I have seen the document. It is genuine. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret stared at him, her lips parted, her hands trembling in Eleanor's grasp. For a long moment she seemed unable to speak. Then a tear slid down her cheek, followed by another. 26 years, she whispered, her voice breaking. 26 years I have kept silent. I thought the family had disowned me entirely. I thought there was nothing left. Your mother told me I had been cut off without a penny, that I was dead to the name Blackwood. I believed her. She lied, Eleanor said, her own tears falling. She lied to you, Mother, and she has been living with that lie while we scraped and saved and pretended we did not mind the poverty. Margaret closed her eyes, a sob escaping her lips. I did not mind the poverty, she said. I chose your father, I chose love, I would choose it again, but the shame of being rejected, of being erased from my own family, it has haunted me every day. She looked at Alexander, her eyes wet but her voice steady. Your mother is a cruel woman, Your Grace, but you are not your mother, I see that. Alexander dropped to one knee before her, a gesture that shocked Eleanor to her core. He took Margaret's hand in his own, his head bowed. I am deeply sorry for the pain my family has caused you. I cannot undo the past, but I can and will make it right. The inheritance will be restored, every farthing. You have my solemn vow. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching. Then slowly she nodded. I believe you, she said softly. The Duke I met once many years ago was a different man, but you have a good heart, I see it in your eyes. She released his hand and patted it gently. Now stand up. A duke should not kneel in a humble parsonage. Alexander rose, a faint, rueful smile touching his lips. I would kneel in 1,000 parsonages if it would help ease the wrongs done to your family. Eleanor watched the exchange, her heart a tangle of emotions. This was the man she had believed cold and calculating. This was the man who had called her a placeholder. He was kneeling before her mother, pledging restitution, his voice thick with genuine sorrow. The walls she had built around her heart were beginning to crack. But as Margaret smiled through her tears and Alexander turned his gaze to Eleanor, a terrible thought pierced the moment's fragile peace. The Dowager had promised to fight. The scandal of the broken engagement loomed, and there were other, darker secrets yet to be revealed, secrets that could destroy them all. She looked at Alexander and the question burned in her eyes. What else haven't you told me? He met her gaze, and for a fraction of a second his expression flickered, a shadow of guilt, a hint of something withheld. And Eleanor knew with a sickening certainty that the worst was still to come. The journey back to Ashworth Hall was one of grim resolve. The air inside the carriage crackled with the unspoken tension of a coming storm. Eleanor sat across from Alexander, her mother beside her, the three of them bound by a shared purpose. Margaret had insisted on returning with them, her quiet strength a steadying force in the face of the battle that awaited. We will confront her together, Margaret had said, her voice firm. It is time the Dowager answered for her sins, not just to me, but to the family name she claims to protect. Alexander had agreed, but Eleanor saw the strain in his face, the tightness around his eyes. Confronting his mother would mean shattering the last illusions of his family's honor. It would mean acknowledging that the woman who had raised him was not merely difficult, but corrupt. When the carriage drew up before the great doors of Ashworth Hall, the household was already in an uproar. Servants clustered in the hallway, their faces pale with shock. Barker, the footman, hurried to meet them as they entered, his expression grave. "Your Grace," he said, bowing, "there has been an incident. Lady Genevieve has arrived. She is in the east drawing-room with the Dowager. She is distraught." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Then we will see them both, now." He led Eleanor and Margaret through the grand hall, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The east drawing-room doors were closed, but the sound of raised voices filtered through, the Dowager's shrill tones and another woman sobbing. Alexander pushed open the doors and stepped inside, Eleanor and Margaret at his heels. The scene within was one of theatrical chaos. Lady Genevieve Ashford, a striking blonde in a pale blue gown, was packing before the fireplace, her face streaked with tears. The Dowager stood by the window, her expression a mask of icy fury. The moment the Dowager saw them, her face twisted with rage. "You," she hissed at Alexander, "you have ruined us. Genevieve's father has learned of your scheme to break the engagement. He is threatening to publish every sordid detail. The scandal will ruin us all." Lady Genevieve turned, her red-rimmed eyes falling on Eleanor. "You," she said, her voice trembling with betrayal. "The quiet little mouse. I thought you were nothing, but you are a viper, aren't you, scheming behind my back, trying to steal my duke." Her gaze shifted to Alexander, and her expression softened into one of desperate pleading. "Alexander, please, I do not care about the scandal. I love you. I have always loved you. You cannot choose her over me." Alexander regarded her coolly. "You do not love me, Genevieve. You love the title, you love the status. You have made that clear from the start. I have never misled you." "That is not true," Genevieve cried, her voice cracking. "I have loved you since I was a girl." But Alexander shook his head. "Your father demanded an impossible settlement. Your mother covets the connection. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. You knew that." Genevieve's face crumpled, and for a moment Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy for her. She was as much a pawn in the Dowager's schemes as anyone. But that sympathy vanished when Genevieve's eyes narrowed with venom as she looked back at Eleanor. "I will destroy you," Genevieve whispered. "If I cannot have him, you will not either. I will make sure every drawing room in London knows what you are, a scheming fortune hunter from a disgraced branch of the family." "Enough," Alexander said, his voice echoing with authority. "You will not threaten Miss Whitfield. She is the rightful heir to the Whitfield inheritance that was stolen from her mother. And you, Genevieve, have no claim on me. The engagement is over." Genevieve gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The Dowager stepped forward, her face livid. "You have destroyed us," she repeated, her voice shaking. "For what? For this? This parson's daughter? You are a fool, Alexander." "No," Alexander said, his voice calm but icy. "You are the fool, mother. You built your life on a lie, and the lie has finally caught up with you. It is over." The Dowager's face went white, then red. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She looked from Alexander to Margaret, who stood silently, her expression one of quiet, devastating dignity. "Margaret," the Dowager whispered, the name a bitter curse. "You ruined my life once. Now your daughter has ruined my son's." Margaret did not flinch. "I chose love, Elizabeth. You chose greed. That is the difference between us. And now you will answer for it." The Dowager let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Answer? To whom? To the courts? To society? You are a nobody, Margaret. You always have been." "She is a Blackwood by blood," Alexander interrupted. "And she is the rightful owner of half of what you have been hoarding. The law is on her side, and I will see that it is enforced." For a long, electric moment, no one moved. Then slowly the Dowager's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. She looked old, suddenly, and utterly defeated. I did it for you, she whispered to Alexander, for the legacy. No, mother, Alexander said, his voice softer now. You did it for yourself. The legacy you claimed to protect was built on cruelty. I want no part of it. Genevieve let out a final, bitter sob and fled the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The Dowager remained, a figure of crumpled velvet and broken pride. Eleanor watched her, and in that moment she felt not triumph but a profound, aching sadness. This was what the Blackwood world did to people. It twisted love into possession, pride into poison. It had nearly destroyed her own family. It had nearly destroyed the man standing beside her. Alexander turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. "It is done," he said quietly. "The truth is out. Whatever comes next, we will face it together." Eleanor looked at him, at the man who had once dismissed her as nothing, who had called her a placeholder. He was not that man anymore. He was bruised and flawed and human. He had risked everything to right a wrong that had been done before he was born. He had chosen her, not as a decoy or a shield, but as an equal. But there was still one more truth to be spoken, one more wound to be healed. She stepped closer to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you call me a placeholder, Alexander? If you truly saw me even then, why those words?" He flinched as though the question had cut him. He took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice was raw. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "The moment you walked into my mother's sitting room that first day, I felt it, a pull, a recognition, and I knew if I let myself feel it, my entire carefully ordered world would shatter. So I tried to make you small in my mind. I tried to convince myself you were nothing. But you were never nothing, Eleanor. You were the only thing that was ever real." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, blurring his face. She had heard his cruel words through a wall, and they had broken her heart. But now, she heard the truth behind them, and it was not cruelty at all. It was terror. The terror of a man who had been trapped by duty and expectation, and who had seen the possibility of a different life in the eyes of a woman he thought he could never have. "I heard you," she whispered, "through the wall, every word, and it shattered me, but I think in some strange way it also saved me. It made me fight, it made me demand to be seen." He reached out, his hand cradling her cheek, his touch gentle. "I see you now, Eleanor, I see all of you, and I love you, not for your inheritance, not for your bloodline, for your courage, your honesty, your quiet, unbreakable spirit. I love you." The words hung in the air, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor looked into his eyes, and she saw the truth of it there, burning bright and steady. She saw the man he could be, the man he was becoming. She saw a future that was not built on lies or titles, but on something far more precious. She did not answer with words. She took his hand, the same hand that had once belonged to a distant, cold duke, and she pressed it to her heart. The beat was strong and steady, a rhythm that matched his own. "I am not a placeholder," she said, her voice firm and clear. "I never was. I am Eleanor Whitfield, and I choose you." A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, and he pulled her into his arms, his embrace fierce and sure. The Dowager, forgotten, turned and walked silently from the room, a ghost at the edge of their joy. Margaret watched, tears streaming down her cheeks, a smile of quiet triumph on her lips. The walls of Ashworth Hall, which had once echoed with careless cruelty, now rang with the silent, powerful truth of love. And Eleanor, the woman who had been told she was nothing, had become everything. Not because a duke had chosen her, but because she had chosen herself, and in doing so had set them both free. The battle was over. The war for their hearts had just begun. And as the winter light faded beyond the tall windows, they stood together, two souls forged in the fires of scandal and truth, finally, irrevocably home.